Welcome back to the Crochet Crowd as well as yarnspirations.com. I'm your host Mikey. Today we're going to talk about gauge, and this is the Let's Knit series, and I decided to show this prior to actually showing you how to hold knitting needles or do any stitch work because the gauge is so important. I'm going to show you a little bit of a pattern today from yarnspirations.com, but we're also going to talk how the knitting needle and the yarn work with each other in order to get the uniform look of stitches as you see. So let's talk about gauge. So let's determine gauge. Gauge is really quite important to allow you to duplicate what a designer has asked you to do. So what we have here is that when a designer makes something, they have their own tension in the way that they've done it, and it's usually pretty close to standard. So what happens here is that even though that you may have the same knitting needle and the same yarn, your tension could be loose or tight depending on your personality. So it depends on what you're watching on television, your stress in your life. Tension can be all over the place depending on you. In crochet, I'm a loose crocheter in the sense that anything that I make is always too big. So to determine gauge, what happens in the professional patterns is that they tell you how many stitches there are within a certain period. So it's either 10 centimeters or it's 4 inches. That's pretty close. And so you just lay it over top your work and you count the number of stitches. In this case there's 13. So I can tell you that at this point is that my gauge is 13 stitches in the width. Then what you have to do is take your 4 inches and go in the height. And what you have to do is you count the number of rows it takes to do 4 inches just like so. And that will be your gauge then in the height just like that. So it really gives you an indication on what you need to do. So you will see this information on ball bands as well as on patterns. Let's take a look at both of those next. So let's take a look at the gauge using Bernat Softy Chunky as an example. We want to rotate this ball so that we get the information that you can see here. And this is telling me here is that if I use an 8mm or a size US 11 knitting needle, that I will get 11 stitches in the width just like this, and there will be 14 rows of stitches in order to get 4 by 4 inches. So this is telling me what this is. So for example, let's say that I use this exact same knitting needle, I use the same yarn, and all of a sudden that when I go to do 4 inches across that I get more than 11 stitches. So say that I get 15 stitches. That means that I would be a tighter knitter than what this is asking me for. Does it make it wrong? Not necessarily, but you have to adjust yourself in order, so that adjusting could mean that you would change the size of knitting needle, or you just relax a little bit more in order to get it to go. Now for example, say that there was only this is really doing it 8 stitches across instead of 11. That means that I would be a really loose knitter, and so therefore it would affect the pattern as well. So that would mean that if I did 11 stitches in that particular format of what I was just working with, it means that I would probably be almost doing like 5 inches wide instead of 4. So you have to really kind of watch this information, and it's really quite important in your work. So this tells you what this is, which is determined by professionals, and so when you're going to look at this kind of yarn, this is a great indication. But most professional patterns also have that information, and let's go take a look at that one next. So this is a free pattern by yarnspirations.com. It's just the garter stitch, and you see it's just one set of instruction, and you do the whole thing, and it's just back and forth doing garter. So this is actually giving you the amount of gauge, and let's just zoom in and see what that's telling us. So in gauges, it's usually 4 inches by 4 inches. Okay, it's a square. It could be 10 centimeters by 10 as well, depending on where you live. So it could either be in metric or imperial information. So it's telling me that with this size of knitting needle that is recommended for this particular pattern, which is a US 19 or a 15mm circular knitting needle, it tells me there will be 5 stitches in just 4 inches of space, and then telling me that there will be 10 rows going in 4 inches in the height. So this gives me an indication of what I need to look for. So for example, say I do this now and I use the exact same information, same yarn, etc., and that I have 8 stitches in order to get to 4 inches. That means that I'm a tight knitter, and so therefore my project will not be as big if I'm following these instructions. But if I, for example, say that I get 3 stitches in 4 inches and not 5, it means that I'm a loose knitter, therefore my project will be bigger. So the advantage is if it's bigger, that means that you will use more yarn, your project will be bigger, and if you are a tighter knitter, it means that your project will be smaller. You may use more yarn too, or you may use less based on depending on your own personality of your own tension. So the gauge is so important to be able to cross mix between the pattern to the yarn ball to the knitting needles, and all of that gauge is determined by your particular tension on the way that you knit. So this is a quick lesson today on learning gauge when it comes to knitting. Until next time, I'm Mikey on behalf of the Crochet Crowd as well as yarnspirations.com. Have a great afternoon, and this is a special edition for knitting.